surplus is going to go to this kind of person who isn't working, as opposed to that kind of these questions of how you organize, they're going to shape everything else about that society. This is no minor matter. This is not about whether you pick your nose with your pinky or your index finger. This has major consequences. And the second thing Marx immediately noticed, once he posed this question to himself, is that societies have radically different ways of organizing this. Let me go back to my simplest example. There are some societies who do not feed their children. They don't. They don't have the workers produce a surplus to sustain their children. They don't want to. They don't care about it. They're not interested in the next generation. There are many famous examples in history where babies, when they were born, were simply left by the side of the road, the way people nowadays maybe leave kittens that their cat has had that they just do not accept responsibility for, and many of them died, as they often did. Likewise, there are societies that don't take care of their old people. They just don't. Or their sick people. In other words, every society has to make a decision. Who's going to do work? Who's going to produce the surplus, the workers? And who's going to get it? And how much are they going to get? Are we going to give our children a lot, but the old people a little? Are we going to give it reverse? Are we going to give neither of them a lot, but the people who run the society or the warriors who keep it, they're going to get a lot? All these decisions have to be made in every society. It's really only a question of whether we become conscious that we're doing that, or whether it's all done blindly. Again, notice the parallel with Freud. We're still doing the things we do. All that psychology does is begin to make us aware of some of the motivations, some of the reasons why we do what we do. That's Marx's goal too. Not for the individual, but for the society. Okay. The fruit of this research led Marx to come up with a conclusion that will be actually our point of beginning, as it is the point of beginning of Marx's mature work in Capital when he analyzes capitalism systematically. And this end point of our discussion today, which is the beginning for where we will continue when we meet next, has to do with Marx's description of the 5 basic ways that human society has organized the production and distribution of surplus in human history. Marx not only argues that these were the 5 basic ways, but he argues that almost every society, when you look at it, has the coexistence at any moment of all of them. All that varies is the different proportions and the relationships among them. Okay, so let me now go through them, and you will see how it builds up to the foundation for an analysis of capitalism. He begins with the system he calls communism. Remember I told you, Marx never wrote a book on communism. He never wrote an article on communism. It wasn't a topic he ever spent much time on. It's important that you understand that, because those who come later and who set up communist parties, communist governments, and so on, and who look for inspiration to Marx, are going to have, as they did, big problems, because Marx didn't write about it. Lenin had to start basically from scratch. He had Marx's critique of capitalism, and that was very useful. But nobody can find in Marx's work, and I've read it all, anything about socialism and communism in any kind of a sustained analysis. He didn't believe in that. He said that was looking into the future for him. He didn't believe in that. If you want that, he once made a joke, go talk to the person in the county fair who has the crystal ball. I don't do that. I analyze what I can see and what I experience in capitalism. So he begins, however, by saying this communism is different. One of the few times he talks about it, very briefly, that what communism is a society which does a very interesting thing. It takes some of its people and puts them to work. They do the work, grow the food, make the clothing, pots and pans, furniture, all the rest. They do that work, But they always produce, as we've already seen, more food, clothing, shelter than they themselves consume. So the first question of communism is, who gets that surplus? What happens to it? And Marx says the communist arrangement is for the people who produce the surplus to themselves get it. The producers of the surplus get it themselves, and they sit around and they decide what to do with it. In other words, the people who produce a surplus, who get a surplus, and who distribute the surplus socially are the same exact people. That was his definition of a communism. And you can see the root, commune, community. It's the community of workers who are also the ones who get the surplus and distribute it. Please notice, for those of you that are interested, that here is Marx's definition of communism. It does not have one word in it about the role of the state, because the role of the state is irrelevant to this issue. Communism is not about the state, for Marx. For other people it is, but not for Marx. For Marx, it's about how you organize the production and distribution of surplus, which is his entry point into analysis. The second kind, not communist, he tends to call by different names. Ancient is one name he gave it. Self-employed is a name I would give it. Here now, think of an individual farmer, craftsperson, someone doing work, who produces enough to sustain himself or herself as an individual worker, but always produces more. I'll give you an example. You do software programs in your garage with a computer. Do you produce just enough software programs so that you can sell them and get enough money to sustain your own consumption? If you did, you'd be out of business pretty quick. Why? You have to pay taxes to a government. Where are you going to get that from? You have to make sure that a little security service goes around your garage at night so you don't get the stuff stolen. Who's going to pay for that? You have to produce a surplus. You have to do more software than just your own consumption because you've got other things to take care of, like a community that wanted to take care of its kids. You might also want to take care of your kids to replace yourself when you wear out or die with another producer of software programs. And Marx says these two class structures, what he calls them, these two organizations of the surplus, have something in common. In both cases, the people who produce the surplus are the ones who get it and distribute it. In the communist case, it's the group of workers as a whole. In the ancient/self-employed, it's an individual worker. Now that takes care of two. Three are left. These three are distinguished from the first two, and I'll give you their names in a minute, by one key fundamental fact. In these three, the people who produce the surplus are not the same as the people who appropriate and distribute it. So there's, right away, a fundamental difference. Marx defines, in capitals, very clear, explicit. He defines any system in which the people who produce the surplus are different from the people who get it. He uses the word exploitation for that kind of a system. This is not about whether you treat people nicely or not, whether you pay them well or poorly. That's a popular usage of the term. That's fine. It's just not what Marx's definition was. Marx was fascinated by class structures, by systems in which you did not, the way you earlier added communism and the ancient, you did not give to the people who produced the surplus the social power and position of receiving and distributing the surplus they had produced. So let's now go through, in the time that remains, the three exploitative arrangements that Marx found in history. The first, slavery. A slave system, Marx explains. Remember I told you he was a reporter for the New York newspaper during the American Civil War and wrote a very famous set of analytical essays on slavery and capitalism. In slavery, who does the work? The slave. The person who is required to raise the crops, make the food, make the shirts and so forth, all of that. And if you know something about slavery, you will know that everything the slave produces is immediately and instantly the property of somebody else. There you can see Marx's gleam. Yeah, I got one. Here's a system in which the producers of the surplus, the slaves, produce much more than they themselves get. The master takes everything the slave produces, gives back to the slave what he feels like it, enough for the slave to survive, so this can keep going, but fundamentally, every bit of the extra, that what the slave produces above what he gets back, belongs to a different group of people, the masters. They get that surplus into their hands, and they distribute it. So that takes three systems: communism, ancient, and slave. Now the fourth, feudalism. In this system, the two types of people are the serfs, what they were called. A slave, I didn't mention this, but a slave, of course, I assume you know that, is not only does everything the slave produce belong to the master, but the slave himself belongs to the master, because that's what slavery means. It's a situation in which one human being can become the property of another. The serf is not a slave. He's nobody's slave. The serf is not a slave. The serf, particularly in European feudalism, but this system exists in many parts of the world at many times, the serf is tied to the land. And I'm going to use the example in Europe. For much of European feudalism, which was the dominant system for 1,000 years, from Russia in the east to Ireland in the west, and everywhere north and south, from Scandinavia to the tips of the Greek islands. The serf typically worked 3 days on land that was allocated to him. And during those 3 days, the serf worked on the land, and whatever he produced or she produced on that land was kept for their own consumption. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, they went to the land of the Lord, the guy who owned the big piece of land that was the dominant character in this system. They were obliged to do that. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, they went and worked on the land of the Lord. Everything that they produced there belonged to the Lord. At the end of work on Saturday, they went back to where they lived, where they worked the first days of the week. And Sunday, because European feudalism was capitalist, they rested and went to church. Okay? Now Marx said here is another exploitative system, because the time the worker, the serf works on the 3 days on his own piece, that's his, as Marx liked to use the phrase, necessary labor. That's the labor, the fruits of which he got himself to consume. It was those second 3 days, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, that he was doing surplus labor. And that extra output, the output of those second 3 days, belonged instantly, automatically, to somebody else who wasn't the serf, the lord of the manor. So there's another exploitative system. Now, before I get to the last, the final one, capitalism, before I get to it, I want to already remind you of what we said earlier. You can see where Marx is going, right? You can see a man whose passion was to build a society premised on liberty, equality, and fraternity, is noticing what? That it would be very hard to expect liberty, equality, and fraternity in a society where one group of people produced a surplus that another group of people got. What kind of equality is that going to permit? If you make a formal equality, we're all equal, but some of us work and produce a surplus that other one of us live off of, the equality is going to be unreal. It's going to be formal at best, phony at worst. That's what you can see where he's going. So now we get to capitalism, which is really where his theory starts. But before we get into the formal theory, which is next time, I want to take you through how